Hello, I'm Cara Dahl Russell, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about the music of Ludwig van Beethoven, who lived from 1770 to 1827, and in particular, his Romance in F major. Now I'm going to start by asking you all to sing a note with me. Ba. And so that's our starting note. If you need to sing an octave lower, ba. And so you're going to start with me on that note, and then I'm going to start to sing a melody and sing along with me once you start to recognize it. Ba, ba da 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 da, ba da 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 da, ba da 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 da, da 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 da. Thanks for humoring me. Thanks for singing along if you did. Hopefully you recognize that. You may not remember the name. That is Bach's Organ Toccata and Fugue in D minor. And even if you're not a classical music fan, chances are you recognize that, if only from horror movies. That work is the quintessential example of a Baroque organ work. Big, it's brash, it's bold, and then increasingly contrapuntal, increasingly very complex. It has so much going on that really one voice can't do justice to the piece because it has all of these parts, these voicings. At the same time, that kind of work was going on with the organ. In smaller venues, the harpsichord was king. Harpsichord works filled with trills and mordents, an extremely codified language that was all meant to be played quickly and with a very light, silken touch on the harpsichord. Now, often these works, either for organ or harpsichord, would somewhere in the middle of a large suite have a movement that was a romance or a pastoral that would be much simpler. It would have a singable melody line, but then it would go back to the complex. It would go back to the highly ornamented. Also at this time, some works were even exploring dissonance and chord structures that would be very much at home in any modern music of John Cage or Morton Feldman. Example, I play a Christmas set of works by Balbastra, who was a contemporary of Couperin, music for the harpsichord. I play it on the harp. And the ones representing religious mystery or miracles are extremely dissonant. They would sit just fine in any contemporary modern music concert. Well, after years of this complex, contrapuntal, and even sometimes dissonant music, highly ornamented, quite simply, people wanted a break. They wanted something simpler. Most importantly, the kings and the nobility, the people who were hiring the musicians and sponsoring the music for their home and their court, these people who often had a bit of musical training themselves, and they wanted to be able to either play along or sing along. They wanted music they could relax with. They wanted the new age music of their day, and that is the development of the classical era of music. Music, first and foremost, intended to please, to entertain. Music that may not always be simple to perform, but at its core, it has a simple melody, a predominant melody that can be recognized and hummed along after hearing. Mozart's work is considered the predominant example of this style and this period, and he also developed and progressed the structures and musical style of this time period and this musical language. As a second part to this lecture on Beethoven, I encourage you, and I will link after this video, to a lecture on Mozart's Horn Concerto. Because that was on the same program with this work. So you can listen to that in a bit, but I'll get back to that there, and you can link to that after you've listened to this lecture and listened to this work of music. Then you can go on to that. Beethoven is generally thought of as the first Romantic era composer, but he was a contemporary of Mozart. His musical playing and his performance style and his composition writing all began in the classical period. So, as a piece of music, this work, this romance, is usually performed on the violin. When I gave this lecture for the Mid-Atlantic Symphony, it was being played by the winner of a youth competition, Beatrice Grushkin, who was playing it on viola. Romance, in these terms, in the classical and late Baroque terms, has a specific meaning. It has 3 beats to the measure, what we usually think of today as waltz time. It is often a slow or a relaxed tempo, and it has a lyrical line, either for solo voice or a solo instrument. In this case, viola or violin. This term, the romance, was originally designated as a term to describe Spanish ballads. And the Oxford Dictionary of Music states that, quote, generally it implies a specially personal or tender quality. As I mentioned, there were romances written in the Baroque period, and these were usually often called air tendre, tender air, or sweet air, air douce. Some of Schubert's Lieder, later in the Romantic period, are romances, and you've probably heard of songs without words, most notably Mendelssohn's, which is more or less what this Beethoven romance that we'll hear now is today. This voice is the violin or the viola. And I'll try to link to a performance of this work played on both viola and violin, so you can compare and contrast how the tonal qualities of those solo voices differ. The other talk that I mentioned, the Mozart Horn Concerto, has a romance at the central section. And romances remain important throughout time. You may have heard this famous Russian melody, Dark Eyes. Da, 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 la, da, That's Dark Eyes. That is a Russian romance. Again, driven by a strong melody, while the accompaniment may vary considerably. So that is the designation romance in musical terms. Beethoven composed this romance in 1787. It was not first performed until 11 years later, 1798, and then it was introduced as the second of a set of 2 violin romances, even though it was composed first. But they were even published later than that. They were published in 1805. It's important that it's generally understood by music historians that this romance was composed by Beethoven, intended to be the central movement of a violin concerto, in much the same way that the Mozart Horn Concerto has the romance movement in its center. That might explain why there was a delay in performance, and then later on the delay in publication of the piece. Beethoven may have been still holding on to it, thinking that he was indeed going to make it the central movement of a concerto. It's worth noting that Beethoven, unlike many other composers, was supremely unaffected by events, either events going on around him societally or his own personal events. In general, he just worked on whatever music he was working on, and the things going on in his life didn't affect what he worked on. But it still may be of interest to note some things that were going on at this time, both societally and in his life. 1787, there were multiple peasant revolutions going on around Europe. And then 2 years later, in 1789, a quasi-war called the XYZ affair. And each one of those letters, XYZ, represented an ambassador between the United States and France. 1787, when this was written, Mozart's Don Giovanni premiered. Of importance to Beethoven personally, he was riding high. He had just completed his bouncy and popular Opus No. 1 piano trio. It's still just effervescent fun today, and it's something else I highly recommend you look up after you listen to this. It's so much fun. He composed this romance a year before he began his studies with the famous Salieri, best known today, rightly or wrongly, as Mozart's nemesis. He specifically, with Salieri, was studying composition with an eye towards creating his first symphony. And so this was a real high point for Beethoven, for him personally, for his work being published, and on the really personal level, this was 3 years before he ever mentioned to one of his friends that he was afraid he might be going deaf. So this really could be the end times of his best times personally. This romance, composed for violin, is actually a very popular tune of his. And the way that we know that, it has been transcribed to be played by multiple other solo instruments. So we have this lovely melody, a beautiful work from a time period when Beethoven was still at a very good place in his personal life. Enjoy.